to the cloud. Okay, so we're now recording. Welcome. It is really an honor and a pleasure to be with all of you. I am delighted by your interest in this topic and thought this could be a bit of an experiment in terms of the format. The chance to study just a little bit at the end of a day, once a week, a topic that we could absorb together, hopefully in 6 weeks. Naturally, in addition to the technical issues that we ran into this evening, someone right outside my home is doing some major work on their garden at this hour. So is that audible to all of you? No, okay, it's okay. A little bit, you're saying. I'm gonna just plow ahead here and hopefully it will be fine. So we have 6 weeks to delve into this most central, probably best known and most beloved piece of our prayer tradition. The Shema is known to us as something that we say as part of a synagogue service. Many of us have the custom of saying it at bedtime. It's traditional custom to recite the Shema before you go to sleep at night. And that has its own particular intention, kavanah, around it. It's also been a custom for many generations for people to say the Shema at the time of their death. So it's something that's on our mouths often, and probably a really good choice by those early generations of rabbis who chose it to be part of our liturgical tradition. Because it's succinct, it's pronounceable, and its meaning is multi-layered and somewhat flexible. So it could survive 2 millennia, many generations of different kinds of theologies and different kinds of spiritual needs by our people. And here we are in the 21st century, gathering to try to discover what it might have to say to us now. I'd like to start some screen sharing. I have an outline of our sessions that I'd like to start with, just to walk you through. Okay, let me just pull that up. Okay, hopefully everyone can see that. Okay, so just to start with, a basic outline of what I hope to do with you over these next 6 weeks. Tonight, we are asking for people to tune in for, it'll be a little less than an hour, about an hour of learning together, to go over the basic structure of this part of the liturgy and to learn something about its history, which will be, I think, fascinating for us. It's got a really remarkable history in its life as a prayer. Next week, we'll actually go backwards on the 24th and start at the beginning of the whole segment of the Siddur in which the Shema is kind of encapsulated or kind of held with the prayer Ahava Rabbah. That's the morning prelude to the morning Shema. In the evening, there's a similar prayer with slightly different language, but which focuses us on God's everlasting love. The following week, we'll go to the penultimate paragraphs right before the actual Shema itself, which have their own meaning and also some ritual elements that get introduced when we're getting ready to say the Shema. Then that first week of September, we'll focus on the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, the central part of what we call Kriyat Shema, the recitation of the Shema. And then following that, the last 2 weeks will be the middle paragraph. We call it the middle paragraph of the Shema, V'haya im shamoa. And I've given that the subtitle, How Does It Work? Because it's in that paragraph that the declaration of the Shema gets broken down into how does this show up in our lives? How does this work in our lives? And then finally, the last session will be the final paragraph of the Shema. which sometimes is called the paragraph of the fringes from the book of Numbers. Okay, so it's just basic outline of our 6 sessions, and I've broken down the Shema segment, the Shema liturgy, into those parts. Okay, so let me stop the share for a moment now, and I'm just going to ask you in the chat if you would be willing to share a word or a phrase that comes up when I say, "What is the Shema?" So there's an infinite number of good answers here. There's no bad response. There's only interesting ways for us to understand this. But I say to you, what is the question? What is the Shema? What would you say? And so the chat is open, and if you would just share what comes up for you. Just curious to hear what is in your mind, and also what's your understanding about this part of our Torah and our... Okay, so I'm just watching these things coming through. Great. I'm going to just read some of these out loud. I won't be able to do all of them, but the central prayer, my Jewish identity, Stuart says, our definitional prayer, part of the daily rhythm, unifying. We will talk about the bedtime Shema and how it's different. It's a declaration. It's an affirmation of our willingness to listen to that godly voice, affirming our belief in God, affirming our covenantal relationship with God, our primary prayer, which something is very comforting to us, universal Jewish prayer. There's no reconstructionist version of the Shema. It's just the Shema, or Reform, or Orthodox for that matter. The major centering, unifying prayer, and I want to catch this, Jackie is saying, in my mind is peacefulness when you say the Shema. Affirmation of belonging and oneness, most sacred belief in God, connection with other Jews. Wonderful. Thank you. Comforting. An attention getter. Great. Opening channels. Wonderful. So I really want to encourage us to hold on to some of these headlines, or these what I would call super titles or subtitles for this prayer. And let's now dig in a little bit to some of the structure and the history of what we call the Shema. Okay, so let me go back to my screen share. And screen share once again. Here we go. Okay, all right, so I'll go past my outline, and want to start by just giving a basic outline of the central portion of the Shema. So the Shema itself is made up of 3 sections. Number 1, from Deuteronomy chapter 6, just those verses 4 through 9, that are probably the best known portion, Shema Yisrael and Ve'ahavta. And then the middle paragraph, which is probably less well known, but right there in the center, from Deuteronomy 11. It's actually from this week's Torah portion, from Parashat Ekev. It's often known by its opening phrase, Vehaya im shamoa. If you will listen, then this is what will happen. And the final paragraph, we know as Vayomer. Again, it's just simply known by its opening word. I will do away with my dog if he doesn't settle down in just a second. Could I ask, Audrey, would you be willing to just read this paragraph for us from Richard Sarenson?
The rabbis, Mishnah Brachot 2.2, chapter 2, verse 2, characterize the content of the first paragraph as acceptance of the discipline, the yoke of God's sovereignty, and the second as acceptance of the discipline, yoke of the commandments. The third paragraph is called both the paragraph about the fringes and the Exodus from Egypt, with reference to the beginning and the end of its contents from the Babylonian Talmud. Early on, there was a difference of opinion as to whether the third paragraph was to be recited in the evening, since one did not wear fringes at that time. But its evening recitation quickly became standard practice.
Great, thank you. Okay, so one of the things we want to grapple with is this traditional rabbinic intention that the recitation of the Shema is about two central theological things. One is what we call Ol Malchut Shamayim, the acceptance of the yoke of God's sovereignty, which is a rather abstract concept, but is inviting us to open our consciousness to this sense of transcendent God in our world. And perhaps even the notion that that transcendence is beyond our ability to understand, certainly beyond our ability to control. And its partner, so the first part we called Ol Malchut, the yoke of God's sovereignty or kingdom. And the second part, its partner, is Ol Mitzvot, the acceptance of the yoke of the commandments, which is much more concrete. The commandments, the mitzvot, are things we live by. They're actions and rituals that we practice as we choose to practice, depending on how observant we are. So it's in the recitation of the Shema that we reaffirm those two things. Again, this is in classical rabbinic understanding, and I want us to hold that classical rabbinic understanding next to all the wonderful things that you all put in the chat as you were offering up how would you explain the Shema, or what is the Shema. So it's all of those things together. But if we're going to study about the Shema, we want to at least have on our radar screen this notion of these two things. The idea of the abstract sense of God's kingdom, God's overwhelming power, and then it's, as I keep saying, its partner, the realm of the commandments, which is ours to do, to work with, to participate in. Okay, let me stop the share again just for a moment. I'll come back to it in a second. So let's think together about how this piece of the Torah became a prayer. And for that, we have to dig back into what we would think of as the Second Temple period, which is the period after the First Temple was destroyed. The First Temple is destroyed in the 6th century BCE. The children of Israel are exiled to Babylonia. When they return from Babylonia, they are able to reconstruct a second temple. And it's in that Second Temple period that we have kind of a proto-rabbinic culture that starts to take hold. And it's within that, what I'm calling a proto-rabbinic phase, that the stem cells or the marrow of our whole Siddur began to be laid down. And the Shema, as we know it today, the Shema and Ve'ahavta and Haya im Shemoa and Vayomer, those already were beginning to be recited regularly as a part of daily prayer already in that Second Temple period. So this is rather interesting because when the second Temple is standing, you still have sacrifices going on. You still have all that priestly ritual happening, but it's sort of at the same time, you can see there's the beginning of a movement towards a liturgical tradition that ultimately, as we know, is going to replace the sacrificial tradition. We generally think of the priestly tradition, the sacrificial tradition, sort of ending in a cataclysm, like it was happening and then one day it just stopped. But of course, nothing happens like that. It was a much slower evolution, which did ultimately reach a moment of cataclysm when the Second Temple was destroyed. But this custom of reciting these verses already was in place when the Second Temple was destroyed. Okay, so now I'd like to look with you quickly at a couple of passages from the Talmud that will show us how they were thinking about this packet of Torah, these verses from Torah. Okay, so let me go back one more time to my source sheet. Here we go. Okay, so now we just read this paragraph written by a Reform Rabbi, Richard Sarensen, who references Tractate Brachot, several different places. So I want to look with you. Tractate Brachot is one of the more famous sections of the Mishnah. Okay, so already here in the Mishnah, which the Mishnah we think was completed in around the year 200 CE. And people who come to our weekly Torah study are used to looking at some of this text. The bolded portions are the actual text of the Talmud, and the unbolded sections are the editor helping us to piece together what we probably wouldn't be able to piece together without it. Okay, so in here, the Mishnah says to us, I'm going to skip down. Sorry. As for what constitutes a paragraph, these are the breaks between the paragraphs, between the first blessing and the second, between the second and the Shema, between the Shema and V'haya im Shemoah, and between V'haya im Shemoah and Vayomer. What they're referring to here when they talk about the first blessing is actually the part of the morning service that comes before the Shema, which we haven't even spoken about yet. But what I'm pointing to here is they're already talking about these separate sections, the Shema, V'haya im Shemoah, and Vayomer. Okay, and just for time's sake, I'm going to skip down. Rabbi Yehoshua ben Korcha said, why in the mitzvah of the recitation of the Shema did the portion of the Shema, in other words, Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad, precede that of V'haya im Shemoah? This is so that one will first accept upon himself the yoke of the kingdom of heaven, Ol Malchut Shamayim, the awareness of God's unity. Sorry, I'm just trying to let someone in while I do this. And only then accept upon herself the yoke of the mitzvot, which appears in that middle paragraph, V'haya im Shemoah. So again, this notion that we need both of these things. We need to grapple with our questions about God's unity, our questions about God's transcendence, if you will. And here the Talmud is saying we got to get ourselves sort of in order with all of that before we take on the mitzvot. I think that the way rabbinic tradition evolved actually is that they have to sit side by side. Okay, and then finally here, why did V'haya im Shemoah precede Vayomer? Why did the middle paragraph have to precede the last? Because the paragraph of V'haya im Shemoah, the one that says, if you do all these things, this is what will happen, and if you don't, this is what will happen, is practiced both by day and night. We say that in the morning and in the evening. While Vayomer, the last paragraph, is only about the fringes, and we don't wear the talit at night. So let me just pause there and kind of get us all back together here. I don't know if everyone's familiar with the custom around the talit, but the custom is that you wear a talit in the morning and you don't wear one in the evening. And that's where the rabbis are jockeying back and forth. Well, do we need to say this paragraph about the fringes, meaning the tassels on the talit, since we don't wear it in the evening? And as we saw, the Reform Rabbi, who we began with tonight, said eventually they just decided to include all of it morning and evening. But you'll notice if you go to an evening service, maybe even a Shiva service, oftentimes the leader will skip over the last part of the Shema because it doesn't have a ritual component to it. So Marcy Greenstein is asking a good question. Don't you wear the talit at Kol Nidre? And Marcy, I don't see you, but you're absolutely right. You do. That's the one night of the year that you do wear a talit. And the way it's often taught is that Yom Kippur, which begins at night, like all of our holidays, is, as we say, neither day nor night. It's a 25-hour period that's sort of unto itself. And so that one night a year, we do put the talit on, as we want to release ourselves from a sense of day and night and just be immersed in our prayers. let me just see if there are any other questions or anything you'd like to ask about what we've gone through so far. My intention this evening was just to lay down at least a little bit of history before we dig through the texts themselves in the coming weeks. Jonathan Cedarbaum is asking, what is the word for yoke and where else it was used? You mean the word in Hebrew for yoke is ol. So the phrase in Hebrew would be ol with an ayin. Ol malchut shamayim or ol mitzvot. And it has a connotation of a burden or a weight. And in fact, I was thinking about, some of you may be familiar with the Yiddish phrase, schwer zu sein a Yid. It's hard to be a Jew. And it's like, you think of Tevye saying that, or I don't know, any number of other Yiddish-speaking people we may have encountered in our imagination or in real life. And there's lots of reasons we might say it's hard to be a Jew. But I think the phrase originally came from this sense, like, you know what? This tradition wants a lot out of us. It's not only sweetness and light and love all the time. And in fact, this central prayer is saying to fulfill our potential as a practicing Jewish person, in the rabbinic tradition, they would say, you need to grapple with this. And again, as Jonathan's pointing out to us, it's in the language of this burden or this yoke, this weight that's on you. So I have more to say about that. I'm also just watching time and want to honor people's time here. Yes, Patty or Harvey is noting that you put on the talit before sundown on Kol Nidre. Okay, Anne Laurie, you're saying, growing up in the Reform movement, you included the second line of the Shema. So if people have a Siddur, go ahead and open up to page 277 so you can hear what Anne Laurie is asking about. Page 277 in the Shabbat, the Kol HaNeshama Shabbat Siddur. And if you don't have it, don't worry about it for right now. This is going to be short. On page 277, you'll see there the top line is the Shema, the one-line Shema that we already recited tonight. And then right below it is the verse Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Leolam Va'ed. And Anne Laurie, you're asking, and I think many of us who have been in synagogues have noticed, in the Reform movement, they say that out loud every time they say the Shema. And in more traditional communities, including ours, we follow the custom of reciting it quietly, almost as if we're saying it to ourselves. And maybe this is a good place to begin to wrap up for tonight. Many of the liturgical customs we have are customs and not law, and this is a good example of one of them. It's a custom to say Baruch Shem kind of under your breath. It's not considered law, so it's not like you're breaking a law if you say Baruch Shem. The tradition is, some people teach the tradition is tied to a midrash, a rabbinic story that was woven out of the Torah's account of Jacob's death. Jacob, our forefather. And so some of you may be familiar with this story. When Jacob was dying, he had his sons all gathered around him. If you've read that part of the Torah, you know that Jacob had choice words for many of his sons, and not all of them were particularly kind or encouraging. And the rabbis take that and say, well, Jacob was just worried. He was worried that his legacy wouldn't be carried on, and specifically his legacy of knowing God. This Jacob is the one that becomes Yisrael, the one who struggled with God, who came to know God. And so the rabbis paint this image of Jacob on his deathbed really worried about whether his legacy was going to be passed on to his children. And so his children, to reassure him, say to him, Shema Yisrael, listen, Israel, our father, Jacob, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. We got it. We get it. We're going to carry on your legacy. Don't worry. And in response to that, Jacob, Yisrael, who has almost no breath left, says, Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto Le'olam Va'ed, quietly, as if to say, thank God you did get the message. You are going to carry on the legacy. And so every time we say the Shema out loud and the Baruch Shem quietly, we dip into a little bit of that generational transmission, which we want to forward successfully, whether as parents, teachers, aunts, uncles, loved ones of all, shapes and sizes. And we look for those moments where we can feel reassured that the legacy we want to pass on is secure. So I think that's a perfectly fine place to end. I would like to end with one more recitation of the Shema before we sign off tonight. So if you're comfortable to do so, just again, maybe uncross your legs. And as we do in the bedtime Shema, take a moment to release any resentments you're holding towards anyone that has crossed your path today. And then also take a moment to forgive yourself for any resentments you may be holding towards yourself, for any mistakes you may have made today, things you wish you hadn't done, things you wish you would have done differently. The night is coming, and the new day will be a chance to start over. And in between, we acknowledge the yoke of heaven and the opportunity of the mitzvot. So please join with me. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Thanks everyone for tuning in. I'm going to hang out here in case you have anything you want to touch base about. And otherwise, I will see you next week at 6:30.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. And Toda Rabah. It was wonderful.
Great to be with you.
Rachel.
Thank you. Lovely to be with all of you.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm leaving on Saturday, but hopefully Stu will join in the sessions that I'll miss.
Good. I hope we will see you, Stu.
Yep.
Thank you so
Looking
much.
forward
Bye.